This show is brought to you by Databril, the scalable Amazon PPC management for large Amazon sellers and brands. Visit sellersessions.com/agency for more details. Hey guys, welcome back to Seller Sessions. Today we've got two guests. We've got Chris McCabe and we've got Paul here as well. Paul, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Paul Raffleson. I'm a tax lawyer. I'm a lawyer, but I specialize in tax litigation. I've been doing a lot of tax law most of my career. I've litigated cases for Microsoft, Walmart, and GE when I was working in-house as one of their tax litigation people. I teach tax law and constitutional tax law in New York, and I currently have a private practice, Ecom Attorneys, and then which we specialize in tax, IP, and other business areas of business law. And then I also volunteer my time as the executive director of the Online Merchants Guild, which is a new trade association started by sellers.
Cool. Sounds good. And Chris?
Right. So Chris McCabe worked at Amazon and Seller Performance for several years. I consult sellers at ecommercechris.com, and in the particular issue today, taxes.
Cool. So I'm going to start with one very, very important question from my point of view. Let me set the scene. Amazon runs this massive business and there's already sellers on the platform. And as sellers, we all know that Amazon owns the customer. If Amazon owns the customers, why are Amazon sellers paying sales tax?
Because Amazon's special. The states are giving Amazon special treatment because you're 100% right. In every fashion economically, Amazon would be considered a retailer. The analogy that I always raise is this sort of concept that if you walk into your local Walmart store or Target store, and if you imagine walking in there and buying, a computer, and you get to the checkout and they don't charge sales tax, you say, why aren't you charging sales tax? They say, well, we converted into a marketplace format. Our Walmart stores are now marketplaces, so Dell Computers is really the retailer. By the way, they're not collecting sales tax, and you're using just our marketplace platform to check out. I mean, it's complete nonsense. No state would ever let any store get away with that. But yet Amazon has done a really great job of lobbying and advocating, especially when they're putting, jobs and warehouses on the sort of table. States tend to want to look the other way. There's states where they've specifically signed agreements with Amazon not to tax the marketplace, or at least not to make them enforce the tax in the marketplace, leaving them to go after the sellers instead. There's states like California, which have just basically flat out refused to make Amazon collect, even though Amazon told them they would collect if they were asked. It's a really, really interesting situation. And one is a tax lawyer who's sort of used to states fighting, tooth and nail to get any dollar of tax they can. I find it really upsetting and disturbing and odd. It's almost like watching a zombie movie, and then you have this one guy walking across that the zombies don't want to touch him. It's like they're going after everybody but the one, and Amazon sort of that unicorn walking through the zombie movie being left alone. It's a really strange situation, because you're absolutely right.
So what are the next steps from the situation from your organization? Obviously, you're in talks with a lot of different people and you're building up this guild. So what are the next steps to protect Amazon sellers, or what pressures have been put on Amazon in order to switch things up?
Sure. So unfortunately not enough. And it's actually bigger than sales tax. I mean, the first thing, before we get into kind of what we're going to do, people need to realize that there's actually really two parts to the puzzle. Sales tax, whether the cost of compliance is $20,000, $30,000, it's much more than 45 states, because you've got, 10,000 tax rates that you're accountable for, and over, 500 little mini jurisdictions that you have to file. So you could end up having to file more tax returns in Louisiana than you do across the states at the state level. So it's bigger than what you realize. That's that first point. The second point to realize is that when you're an FBA seller, states are going to assert that you have an income tax responsibility as well, that certain federal protections that protect businesses from being subject to income tax won't apply because of the FBA presence that states believe you have. I don't believe that, and we can get into that later, but that income tax problem is huge, because the cost to file income tax returns isn't cheap. It's way more expensive than sales tax. So, think about it. Every person's situation is different, right? You might have different deductions than the next person. You have your income from a spouse, your kid, all that stuff gets factored in, because you may have to file for your LLC or whatever business entity you have in the state, and then you're going to have to file personally in just about every state, certainly every state that Amazon has a warehouse in. And so the cost of that on a per return basis, conservatively, I mean, or sort of, I don't know if conservative is the right word, but at the very least is going to run between $500 to $1,000, and I think that's extremely low. I think when you're consulting a Massachusetts attorney to help you file a Mississippi tax return, you're going to find the hours put in to do that are going to be high. So when you factor the income tax and you factor the sales tax, all of a sudden the cost of compliance is over $100,000 easily, because it's insane. And then you factor in the amount of man hours or person hours you have to put in to get the numbers right, because sales tax, income tax can't be streamlined, right? When everybody sells the same product into the same state, in the same town, at the same price, it's the same tax. It's a streamlined process that's a little bit cheaper to comply with. But with income tax, again, everyone's situation is different. So you get to that six-figure compliance. And that's usually when I talk to people and we start talking about that they realize, okay, maybe going in and registering isn't the best idea. And a lot of the tax service providers haven't done a really great job of sort of highlighting that point. It almost seems like they really kind of downplay it. A lot of my clients who come from the tax service providers have never heard of income tax, which to me is really shocking and surprising. Of course, most of the service providers I've seen, the main ones I know in this area, tend not to offer income tax services. So I guess they don't feel the need.
I'm kind of surprised I don't hear that particular question more, where people come to me and say, well, what are the costs associated with this? I know they might be high, but how much of my resources will be tapped? How much of this will be administrative versus hiring a tax attorney versus hiring a tax analyst versus paperwork processing fees? I mean, that's what people need to kind of move this conversation to, segmenting their costs and the time, the energy associated with gathering all this together. If that's something you suddenly have to assume on top of all your other Amazon account operations, that's a key question. I mean, I'm surprised sellers haven't asked me that particular question as often as like media and reporters have asked me that question, because the media seems very interested in how sellers will be overly burdened by this. And I think generally in the details of that burden, and generally speaking, sellers are concerned and afraid, but I don't know if they're going the extra mile to do the research and educate themselves on these kinds of particulars, which could be business killers, depending on what your situation is.
So what is happening through your interpretation, through the sellers that you've met? What are people implementing now? Because obviously some people are doing nothing. Some people don't know what to do and still completely confused. Some may feel like they'll go to some sort of like a tax company who are rubbing their hands together and go, I'll register you in every state. Is that going to be, do you see where I'm coming from? It's like, it's a boom business for some. This is a great opportunity, Right.
I mean, Avalara went public. I don't know if you know that. They had an IPO just shortly before the Wayfair decision, and I think their stock was up 14%.
That was convenient, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, they were sure to go public before that decision. I guess they were confident in the outcome, although, the real outcome and what sort of the perceived outcome is two different things. But to kind of get to your point, there's multiple buckets of sort of situations that, the sellers are in right now. There's those who've been contacted by the California and or Washington state for back taxes, as those two states are hyper aggressively pursuing sellers for, 8 years of back taxes. A little funny thing about, California particularly going after Amazon for 8 years of back taxes. Amazon itself only started collecting less than 6 years ago. So somehow Amazon FBA creates your nexus, but yet you owe more back taxes than Amazon did when it was actually, on its own sales, because you owe back to 2010, whereas Amazon only had to start collecting in late 2012. So it's an absurdity the way California is behaving. But you have that bucket of the people who are being sort of pressured to owe the tax, are getting questionnaires, are getting harassing phone calls. We had sellers threatened with jail time, which I mentioned in the Supreme Court brief I wrote for Online Merchants Guild on the Wayfair case. I wanted that in the brief. And then we had the sellers who were worried. Do I register? Do I register in? Do they sort of triage, right? Am I going to register in California, Texas, Florida? My big states where I think my exposure is the most. Do I just register? What's the implication, right? I mean, registering in Florida, certainly going forward, is less of a burden because Florida is a state without an income tax, but there still may be other considerations. So, there's a way, if people are convinced that they want to register, there's still a better way to do it. There's the people who want to bury their heads in the sand. A lot of those people out there, and it's frustrating because they feel like that's worked for them so far. But, the states, now that they have this decision, they're going to operate under a mandate. They believe this is a mandate from the court to do whatever the heck they want. And so unless, people start taking action, and start asserting their rights to protect themselves, it's just going to be a nightmare eventually. And it's going to be, unless you're in that top tier of seller, it's going to be really hard to comply. In fact, one of the top tier sellers I was talking to is, thinking they're going to have to hire a full-time tax professional for their business just to kind of stay in compliance. And that's a problem.
Yeah.
There's a lot of paralysis. I mean, let's be honest. A lot of people can't get their minds around it. They're not sure what to do. They hear conflicting bits of information, which is fine to have different sides and a healthy debate. But if it results in, well, I'm not going to do anything because I know a lot of people who aren't doing anything either, I'm not sure that's the solution. Educating yourself, part of that is also making a decision to actively not do something, if that makes any sense, which it probably doesn't. But there could be a cost associated with forcing yourself to ignore the issue.
Yeah. So as it currently stands, then, for people that put their head in the sand, for instance, or are unaware and uneducated on the subject and still confused, even though they tried to educate themselves on the subject, what should they do right now as baby steps?
So it's interesting. So, I mean, if you're concerned about the situation, if you're concerned about a state, I mean, obviously it's self-serving for me to say hire counsel and consider, whether or not your lawyer is even qualified. Like, I really should not be helping Amazon sellers. My client base is the Fortune 500. I used to be a seller, and my wife actually used to work with Chris, and I actually have a lot of that familiarity with what Chris does. Obviously not as recent, but I kind of always have been interested in what you guys did because I was a seller, and I still kind of quasi-sell at the moment. Yeah. But hire one that really understands your business. I mean, hire one that's not going to just say you have Nexus and therefore you have to comply, because that's not the analysis that should be going on right now. Yeah. A lot of times, the biggest thing right now I've had to do with sellers actually is those who just kind of don't know what to do but are really scared and kind of come to me and say, am I going to lose my house? Because I do get that question a lot. I've been, really doing a lot of restructuring work with them, helping them sort of, okay, well, how can we structure your affairs so that if the state comes knocking, you're insulated from liability as best as possible, that you have sort of a fighting chance to stop the states from trying to assert.
Right. You might not be.
Officer of liability. And it's also a good thing to do because if you sell consumer goods, and somebody gets hurt, it's actually a good thing to have in that place, because we saw there was a recent case, not to digress too much, but there was a recent case in Tennessee where the judge ruled, he clearly had no idea what he was doing, and it's Tennessee, that Amazon was not liable in a products liability lawsuit when a hoverboard that was sold via the marketplace burned down the person's house, and they even had knowledge that the hoverboards were dangerous and all that stuff. And what that tells me, and what every lawyer I talk to who's in the litigation space says, especially the class action lawyers, is that Amazon's bulletproof right now. Between, where the courts stand on arbitration, it's really impossible to get a good court case against Amazon if you're in contract with Amazon. So that means sellers really will not be able to bring a case. Customers probably won't be able to bring a good case. So lawyers are reluctant to bring cases, especially ones where it's not paid for up front, which is nearly never going to happen. That's interesting, though, Paul. I mean, Amazon's contracts, are that infallible versus every other Fortune 500 company? Why is that? They hired the best talent and the best intellectual. A lot of companies go with arbitration. I think it's just the volume of what Amazon sells makes it more susceptible to that. I mean, Walmart, you slip and fall inside of a Walmart store, you're not necessarily pushed into arbitration, right? It's not that Amazon's really, got amazing lawyers. It's just that the way, we just had a case at the Supreme Court on mandatory arbitration clauses, and it's just the court keeps upholding them. There's federal law that supports arbitration, and so as long as that's the case, I mean, a fair day in court is not going to happen. And litigators don't think that they have a good chance of breaking breaking through those arbitration clauses in the current environment. So Amazon really gets to rely on that. So what that means, going back to the liability section, is that if a business were to have a judgment against you because somebody got hurt, the lawyer's not going to go after Amazon. They're going to go after you, because everybody's liable in product liability. In other words, you can go after anybody you want in the process. So they're going to go after the low-hanging fruit, which is going to be the seller. They're going to, they're going to get as much as they can out of your insurance policy, and then they're going to go after you personally. So it's a good wake-up call too for sellers to kind of think about, if you've made some money, if you put some stuff away, if you have some assets, if you have a family, now might be the time to start rethinking how your life is structured, because you do sell products that are, high risk, because, anything can happen. It could be Amazon's fault that the product broke and blew up in somebody's house, but it's still going to be you on the hook.
Yeah.
Amazon's impossible to sue.
I think sellers are used to the idea of hiding from Amazon, right? They don't want to poke the beast, poke the dragon, and they might be misapplying that principle to this, because sometimes in Amazon, because Amazon's so confused internally, especially my former teams, you can fly under the radar, or you can get away with certain things, at least for a certain amount of time. I'm not sure we can assume that state governments operate the same way, as bureaucratic and convoluted as some of their paperwork might be, and as mixed up as they might get in terms of who to chase and for how much money and when. They eventually, if they can get some money out of you, will come looking for money. I mean, they've got years to sort this stuff out.
Right.
But if they have a track record of coming to you looking for back taxes from 2011, 2013, 2015, whatever year it is, that means how can you sleep well at night now and rest assured that they won't ask you for anything, from previous years? I mean, these are taxes. Of course, they'll come asking for previous years if they think they can get it.
Yeah, well, to provide some, actual examples to what you just said, I have 2 clients right now in Washington State who have sort of, Washington recently came out with a sort of a compromise deal that if you basically come forward by July 31st, even if you're already under audit, they sort of extended the quote unquote courtesy. They'll limit the look back to 4 years and reduce the penalties and interest that they charge you. I believe it's the interest. So what ends up happening is those of my clients who wanted to kind of investigate it, at least see what the deal was, they see these bills. You owe $400,000, but then they take $200,000 off. So it's like, oh, great, I only owe $200,000. So it's like, on the one hand, they're like, this is ridiculous. I owe $200,000. On the other hand, they're like, geez, if I don't do this, I could owe them another $200,000, despite the fact that it's highly unconstitutional. But, and the only thing I can tell them, I mean, it's everyone's own risk decision, right? This whole podcast is for information purposes only. I'm not giving legal advice. But is that, that's one state. What happens? So you spend $200,000, you barely have $200,000 to spend to pay Washington. What's going to happen next when California comes? What's going to happen when Massachusetts comes? I mean, at some point, you're just picking the first state you're going to pay. At some point, you're going to run out of money to pay all these states. Maybe that's not the way to go. Maybe think of some alternative ways you can handle the situation, because, there is a case to be made. I mean, this is unconstitutional. It's a violation of state law, in my, again, non-legal advice opinion. For your first question, Washington state law has very specific rules about who is a retailer, what's the definition of a consignment. Right? I mean, these are all examples of laws that, a reasonable person could rely on to say, oh, well, this is Amazon's responsibility, not mine. But they're operating under mandate to basically protect their home, their favorite home company right now. And they're refusing to give the sellers any leeway or any break. They just go after them as if they've been these scofflaws the whole time, when it was obviously Amazon that was.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't want to deal with, there's kind of a political element, there's a financial element, you have to educate yourself on taxes, you have to educate on what different states are doing. A lot of people just want to say, oh, can't I just hire TaxJar and not worry about this? Isn't there a solution where I just, bring in a service provider, whether it's TaxJar or Avalara, and I don't have to think about this whole thing?
The problem is
but what if that costs you way more in the long run than if you think about it now? That's my question.
Exactly. You might as well just open your wallet and say, help yourself. Like, no one wants to be reamed, do they? So you're in a situation where it's not like it's very clear. It's like, here's your path. This is what you meant to do. These are all the steps that you take. These are all the states. This is what we do here. Because like you said, it's political. It's like, if there was in unison across the states, it's completely different. But like in the UK, we added tax, which is on the inside of the sale price. Yeah. So we're responsible for the VAT there. Sorry, I used the word tax. They're separated. VAT is different to sales tax. Sales tax gets taken on the end, and it's different state by state. VAT is a set rate determined by your VAT setup. You might be on a flat rate, 0 rate, 20%, or whatever it may be, but it's straight across the board. You understand exactly what it is, right? But in the US, for instance, each state is different. So they collect differently. The paperwork's it's just a complete fucking nightmare for people to deal with.
Well, the thing about
you're in the UK. Go ahead.
The thing about that too, it's that well, for one, there's the same question about who's ultimately selling to the consumer, and whether you should be collecting that through your stage of the process, and then Basically, as Amazon takes the product from you via FBA, then you should basically be sort of rebating the VAT as Amazon is needs to remit for its picking up of the product, or what's the right way to handle that. But the thing about that is that you have unification, right? You have VAT unification laws for every European country is the same. The definitions are in unison. And the other thing is, if you're not a huge seller in Europe, you actually have the ability to do single payer systems where you can pay one country. So you can pay Germany, and in fact, if you do ever have to register with one country, stick to the Germany's. Germany is probably the best country because they efficiently pay out refunds the most. I don't know if people realize that. If you're paying into Greece and you try to get a refund on your VAT, it's going to take a while. Whereas if you have the choice to specifically choose one country, we tend to think Germany is the best country for VAT, in terms of getting rapid refunds. But back to the point, but even then, once you register for VAT, you still have international tax treaties that kick in that say, my presence in the Netherlands is not such that they can establish what they call permanent establishment over me, which is this comparable, foreign equivalent to Nexus, right? What we do with countries. So you're not required to then pay Dutch income taxes on to boot. Whereas with the states, and that second layer of taxation under our federal system, right? The Supreme Court has said the states are not even required to state tax laws basically aren't subject to U.S. tax treaties. So in other words, the states can, even if you don't have a permanent establishment as defined under Article 5 of the tax treaty or generally under the tax law in your country or in our country, depending on the situation, you still can be subject to state income tax. So it's ridiculous. You may have the same tax burden as a resident, just so you can comply with the states, even though at the federal level in our country, you're not subject to the tax. So it's a really messed up system compared to the way Europeans do it.
Yeah. So because of that, that's where a lot of the confusion lies. And I imagine, and I don't know nothing about politics. It doesn't really interest me. You guys will know more about this, but obviously the rates are being different in each of these states. There's a reason behind it. There's no way that you're going to get all of these states to agree to a flat rate, are you? Because there's too many politicians involved for each of these states for it to ever get a unison, would you say? Or
yeah, well, the sales tax in general is what we call a regressive tax. So states that tend to be more liberal tend to rely less on the tax, except for Washington, which has a constitutional bar on income tax, which is why they have a high sales tax. But generally, right, it's a regressive tax, meaning that a person who makes $40,000 a year is going to spend, close to 100% of their income every year. So more than 100%, so closer to 100% of their income will be subject to a tax. Whereas Warren Buffett will likely spend, a fraction of a percent of his income in a year. So a fraction of a percent of his income will be subject to transaction taxes. So that's sort of the concept of regressive tax, and VAT is considered the same too. And so what ends up happening is state policies tend to dictate rates. Then you'd also have the state and local rates, right? You have the city rates, the town rates, the county rates. As I said before, every parish in Louisiana has its own mini Department of Revenue. So you can get audited by Jefferson County Parish, you can get audited by Baton Rouge Parish, you can get audited by Louisiana, you can get audited by, Colorado, Aspen, this concept of home rule jurisdiction. And there are hundreds of those jurisdictions, and meaning that you can't even file those tax returns on the same form that you file with the state. So it's a bloody mess.
Are people in the UK and EU who sell on .com talking about this, doing anything about it, avoiding it? What would you say?
No, people are complying where they can and through their understanding. That's all they can do. I'm not here to speak on other people's tax situations, but people do try and comply. And there are obviously people out there who won't try and comply if they can't. It's just the same as people trying to evade tax who sell from China to the UK and US to the UK. People are going to set up their businesses in a way to look at the best tax efficiency as possible. Isn't that true? Yeah. And there are people, and there are people that will try and push the needle, and there are people that go, do you know what? It's not worth the effort. But everyone doesn't go, let's make a tax inefficient business, do they? No one does that.
I think he's right. That even the Supreme Court has recognized that we have a right to ensure our affairs in a tax efficient manner.
Yeah. So, the judge himself is going to want to make sure he's set up correctly for paying his own taxes. He doesn't want to pay over the top. So I'm not here to speak on other sellers, but there is a mass confusion for everyone outside from the UK and the EU that are selling on .com. there is still that confusion. And some of them have been reamed. Some of them are signed up to these tax and filing zero returns and God knows what. It's just like, and then, you know, part of it is like, is it worth it? All you're doing is you're selling in the US just so that you can lace the pockets to some tax people filing forms with zero at the other end. You know, it just doesn't make any sense.
It's interesting timing. I mean, I went to Amazon Boost, right? The global selling team was there in a big way, trying to get people to sell in Europe. But obviously in Europe, they're trying to get people to sell in .com 10 times more.
Yeah.
No mention of this, by the way. They're not going to talk about the tax implications. They want as many Germans, for instance, to be selling in the U.S. as they can get as part of this drive in 2018, 2019, to get as many cross-marketplace selling as possible. But the Supreme Court decision, I don't know if we're segueing into more analysis on that, but I mean, what that decision meant to me, at least in my layman's interpretation, is that you don't even necessarily need physical presence in the state. If there's any online transaction that is in any way associated with a customer or a party in that state might try to get a piece of that cash, a piece of that action.
Hey guys, that's it from us. Please rejoin us again in a few days' time.